and welcome to this special episode of the Equip Project podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Rico Tice. Rico, it's really great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ollie.
I was wondering, just as we start off, if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I was converted at 16, and pretty quickly after I got converted, I realized the chaplain didn't really believe the gospel at the school I was at. So John Stott always said there were three reasons for ministry: love, truth, and anger. And I think I'm in the third category. I just couldn't believe he wouldn't tell people the truth of Jesus. So I think that was a real call to ministry, thinking, gosh, they're just not saying it clearly. At least I believe it. So I get converted at 16, and I've spent the last 30 years on staff at All Souls Langham Place, which is where John Stott was a clergyman. Right in the centre of London. So as you watch the BBC News, they go over the church just as it starts. And I've been on staff here as an evangelist. So my job is to equip God's people for works of service, to try and help the church family do evangelism. I've spent the last 24 hours sending out a 4-minute summary of just the Queen's words about her Christian faith from the different speeches she's made. So sending that to the church family so they can send it out to their friends. So that's just classically trying to equip them to tell others the gospel and, be on staff doing the normal jobs of a pastor around that.
Brilliant. And I had the privilege of spending a little bit of time at All Souls as a student. And I've always been so excited to know that there's a gospel church right at the heart of London. I think it's a wonderful opportunity that you guys have there at All Souls. And I also watched that video of the Queen's words that you sent out. I thought it was really brilliant. So thank you so much for sharing that resource with the wider church. In this conversation, I'm really keen to discuss evangelism and particularly consider how we should approach evangelism in what's a pretty hostile culture, to be honest. And that's something we address on this podcast regularly, Rico, some of the cultural challenges that we face as Christians. But I'd love to think about, what does evangelism look like in that context? So you mentioned briefly your own conversion. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, how you actually came to faith yourself.
Yes, well, on the 6th of August, 1982, so probably before you were born, Ollie, I'd imagine.
It was a little bit.
My godfather was killed in a cliff fall. And it's been interesting during COVID, because COVID has been about many people waking up to the fact of death. And the Bible often talks of that. You sort of wake up to your mortality and the fragility of your life. Well, on the 6th of August, 1982, my dad got a phone call. His older brother had been killed in this cliff fall. He'd been on a yacht, stopped at a small island, walked around it, tried to climb over a tree, slipped and had fallen and hit his head, and 24 hours later had died. And that was the first time I saw my father die. And I realized that no one in my family had ever talked to me about death. It was just a taboo subject. But I realized at that moment, I woke up to the fact I would die. And then back at my school, there was a maths teacher there who said, to me, look, Rico, when Jesus got through death, he got through death in order to get us through. And I remember thinking, if that's true, because I now realize how short life is, it's the most important thing in the world, because we're not here for long. And I've buried 9 of my school friends. And, we over the grave, you say these words, as for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. So we can flourish, but the wind blows over it, its place and remembers it no more. But we're gone so quickly. And so that issue for the last 40 years of the brevity of my life, and the fact that verse 17 of Psalm 103, from everlasting to everlasting, the Lord's love is with those who fear him. So if you're in relationship with God, you can live forever through that. It's always been the most important thing in the world. I thought, well, what else can be more important than if eternity's there living for it?
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And I think particularly in light of COVID, as you mentioned, in light of the Queen's death recently, death has been very much front and center of our minds, hasn't it? And I think the gospel just brings such hope in the midst of hopeless situations.
Yeah, and I think, therefore, in our evangelism, I mean, what you have to say is, you say, look, this is a bit of an intense question. and the friendship's really important. So do you mind if I, please, I hope it's not too pressurized, but do you have a philosophy of life that copes with death? Now, in our evangelism, Ollie, there's always going to be a bit of a pain line we cross. It's never that easy. But say, do you have a hope for this moment? I don't mean to sound too intense, but do you? And I think what we know statistically is that 20% of people have really had their worldview shaken by COVID. So a lot of people just love darkness. John chapter 3, they want to go back to their sin. But a lot of people are going, oh, my goodness, this is haunting. What do I do? And but trouble is, we don't know who that 20% are. So we got to ask people and, see where we go from there.
Absolutely. And I remember early on in COVID, a lot of people were Googling things like, kind of how to pray and things like that as well, which was really significant, I thought.
I had an amazing moment. I was door knocking up my street on that first Easter Saturday of 2020. And I just was door knocking and saying, could you listen online to our church service tomorrow morning? It's Easter Day. We're not running a service, but we'd love you to listen online. And it was so funny. This one neighbor, and I've never had that response. She said, and jolly right too, you should have told me. Why didn't you come and tell me earlier? Now she's a complete non-Christian, this woman.
Wow.
I mean, it was just amazing, but she was incensed that I hadn't earlier knocked because my job was to tell people about hope. And so I said, well, do please join us online. Why wouldn't you come earlier? I couldn't.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. I've also had the privilege of taking a look at your book, Honest Evangelism. And in that you write this, you say, we're in a culture of growing hostility to Christianity. It's not just apathy we face, it's antipathy. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you understand this cultural movement and what you see as being the greatest obstacles to people being open to the gospel.
Well, brother, the first thing to say is that Jesus said to us, I send you out as sheep among wolves, Matthew 10, 16, 17. So it's always hard to be Christian. It's always the aroma of life and the smell of death, for some people. So I don't think it's ever easy to be Christian, but I think there are cultural waves that make it more difficult. But whoever you are, you've got to have your identity in the grace of God, so that whether someone accepts or rejects you doesn't make you valuable. What makes you valuable is Christ died for you. While we were still sinners, God demonstrates his love for us in this. Christ died for us, Romans 5, 8, 9. So have I got that clear, that that's my identity? So, I've just got that resilience because in my inner man, inner woman, I know I'm loved because of the grace of God. Now, let's get that clear first. So I don't want to say this culture's harder than another. You go around the world, they'd have a wry smile when I say it's tough because they're actually dying for the gospel. Northern Nigeria, Bishop Ben Kwashi, I know. I mean, his darling wife, Gloria, was raped by people and he's seen many of his congregation killed. So first thing is it's always going to be hostile. But in this culture, we've had a benign period of approval. So All Souls, my church, was orthodox and loved for 50 years. But now we're back to the normal gospel thing, which is, this is hostile. So I think that's the first thing to say. I don't want to say it's, let's not think it's any different, but I think the culture is hardening. And so in the face of that, just get your identity clear. And so, Ollie, having got that clear in place, just go back to the question again.
Yeah, so I guess, with that understanding, I think that's a really fair point as well. With that understanding that that's almost normal, I guess, what would you say are the greatest obstacles at this kind of present cultural moment? What would you say are the biggest challenges to people being open to the gospel?
Well, I think that there is the culture that has won the culture war is progressive liberalism, which is this absolute focus on individual identity. I can do as I please, and how dare you judge that? So John Stott said about Matthew 7, the road to destruction is defined by two things, tolerance and permissiveness. Tolerance, I can think as I please. Permissiveness, I can do as I please. Now, what's interesting is when I wrote Honest Evangelism, I think it was harder then than it is now because, I want to be encouraging, I think now, as I'm looking around and having conversations, people are much more worried about where the culture's going than they were. So that road to destruction, there's sort of a handing over to darkness, as people just go, well, it's gone mad. So, J.K. Rowling just says, I think, she was a woman who herself experienced being battered. And so she says there needs to be a safe place for biological women, and she's vilified. Now, again, we've got to put our arms around the transgender community and be incredibly gentle. But nevertheless, I think there is a real sense of what is happening, because we don't know what it is to be male and female. In the recent debate, Richie Sunak and Liz Truss, one of the first questions in the first debate is, what is a woman? Now, I'm actually finding evangelism a lot easier, because people are going, where is this liberal progressive train taking us? So actually, I almost, Ollie, I want to be encouraging. I think it's a lot better now than it was 5 years ago.
That's really encouraging. And actually, I think it ties in with some of the things that Jim and I have been sort of discussing on this podcast in general. And that's that actually the gospel really explains a lot of the mess that we're in. I think the failure of our kind of culture and society actually is a really strong apologetic argument, because as we see it fail and we see the confusion and the mess people get themselves into, we actually see that God's way is best, that the gospel story is best and ultimately is true.
That's true, Ollie. And then there are two things that I've got to be doing. If you're a student listening and you're heading to uni, there are two things I've got to do. Number one, tone. People have very sharp to the tone. I mean, if there's a viciousness in my tone, and that has been true of Christians in the past as they've attacked the culture, I've really got to be for you in my tone. But secondly, just cross the pain line. In my book on evangelism, I'm talking about that, and ask good questions like, what do you think's happening in the culture? How is it going? My niece Lena Tice was in the Olympic hockey team, and are they, at one point we were asking the question, are they going to allow transgender men to play in the hockey? And because of the testosterone, these guys are in different shape in terms of the strength they've got because of that hormone. So you're sitting there thinking, gosh, she's given her life to trying to play hockey at that level, and then suddenly is being put onto a field with someone who's biologically gone through puberty as a man. So those questions we can ask. The culture is reeling with them. It's not easy to work out. So, but ask the question gently and graciously with a smile, and also maybe say, hello, this friendship's important, but can I ask where you are on that? So, but I think we just, as a mind, Jesus asked 300 questions. We just get good at asking questions. Yeah,
that's excellent and really useful for us who maybe are just starting uni or going into the workplace.
And then the group that are the real heroes in all this, in terms of what I find are the people who are the same-sex attracted Christian celibates. So the Living Out people at livingout.org and other organizations who are Christian, and they say, because I love Jesus, I'm same-sex attracted, but I'm celibate, and I delight in living under his lordship. So then you're saying to the non-Christian, is it okay that we provide a safe place and a home for this minority within a minority who are same-sex attracted, but they want to follow Jesus, they're celibate? Will you allow them to have a safe place? Now, if the non-Christian goes, no, they're the wrong type of gay, then who's the bigot? Who's the homophobe? So just ask. Often they always think it's binary and a bit brutal, but you say, no, this isn't binary. This is nuanced. What about that group of same-sex attracted people who are saying, no, I want to follow Jesus. I believe he knows what's best for me. I therefore want to be celibate, but please encourage me and be a safe place at church for me. And I found they have been game changers, that group, because when the non-Christian hears about that, they tend to go, well, because they've been taught that the minority needs to be protected. They go, well, fine, I think that's okay. So again, that group, livingout.org, have been, incredibly important. And then the group coming out of Northern Ireland who've done the same, which is the X Out Loud group, emerging ex-LGBT voices. Again, their stories. Just what do you make of their stories? So, Ollie, I think that's really changed the game for me in the last 3 years as an evangelist. I'm far more on the front foot than I was in terms of proclaiming the gospel in the culture.
Brilliant. No, that's so helpful, Rico. I was wondering about this, and I'm interested to hear how you respond to this. Would you say it's fair to say there's almost three main groups of people we're sort of witnessing to? There's the apathetic people, the religious people, and then the antagonistic people. Maybe that's too simplistic, but would you see those three groups of people in your witnessing? And if so, do you think our approach to evangelism should differ depending on what group we're kind of communicating with?
Well, I think underlying, Ollie, I think the big thing I've got to realize is that Satan has blinded their eyes. So that however they define themselves, whether it's, apathetic, religious, antagonistic, the key thing is they're blinded by the devil. So 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, the reason they're not Christian is the God of this age, that's the devil, has blinded the minds of unbelievers. So they cannot see who Jesus is. Now, what does that mean? That means two things. Number one, whether it's religious, apathetic, antagonistic, the first thing I must do is pray. I've got to pray for the miracle that God will open their blind eyes. I spoke to a girl, Anne-Marie, on Sunday, who was marvelously converted in March. And she said she was a sort of spiritualist life coach. And she said, I was watching one of the videos and I suddenly realized that it was deeply evil what I was watching. And I cried out, Jesus, and she was converted. She's been thoroughly Christian ever since. It was a miracle.
Wow.
So as you say something of Jesus, what happens? Well, verse 6 of 2 Corinthians 4, the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory in this displayed in the face of Christ. In other words, God takes the power that made the world and he opens people's blind eyes. So, and he gets them to see who Jesus is. So conversion is a moment of recognition, of identification. I see who Jesus is. So let's begin by saying people are blind. They're dead in their transgressions and sins, Ephesians 2:1. We need a miracle, and therefore the results belong to God because we need the miracle. So you, Ollie, I know you've come from a lovely Christian home, but that's not why you're Christian. You're Christian because God did a miracle and opened your eyes to Jesus. Because I know people from lovely Christian homes, they're stone cold atheists. So the first thing we need is a miracle. Then we need to pray. But then what I need to do is 2 Corinthians 4 verse 5. I need to speak of Jesus now, and be their servants. So now, when we come to these three groups of apathetic, religious, and antagonistic, I've got to work out the right question for them, or where they are. Ask a question, say something of Jesus, but praying that God will be opening eyes. Does that make sense? And then we can move into that group of those three and say, okay, what's the right question for that friend?
That is really helpful, Rico. And just to kind of then press a little bit, because I think a lot of us feel very daunted when we come to speak to particularly someone who's antagonistic, I guess. Do you think, let's take each category in turn. Do you think there are specific questions then that would be helpful for someone? Let's start with someone who's apathetic. How could you sort of maybe go about seeking to ask a question that would maybe provoke an interest or a conversation?
Brilliant. So the first thing I do then, realizing I need the miracle, is I'm thinking as I'm with people, I'm thinking, okay, is it that they can't believe it because intellectually they're not persuaded? Or is it because they won't believe it because they just love darkness and want to go on sleeping with their girlfriend? I've mainly been in rugby circles or whatever. So I'm trying to work out if it's can't or won't. Now, if it's can't, I'm going to sit and try and debate. But if they're antagonistic and won't, what am I then going to do? Well, I want to love them. So what I want to do is I want to celebrate them, which means play the sport, do the music, enjoy them. Secondly, I want to serve them. And then thirdly, it might be a question, they might be antagonistic, but I might say, mate, I know this may not mean much to you, but at this time of year, I'd be praying that I could take friends to a carol service. I'm going to a rugby dinner on Thursday evening. I'm going to try and invite one of the guys there who's just retired to a carol service. So it's celebrate them, serve them, ask a question, and exit. So Jesus says, wipe the dust off your feet. So if it's not working, then just go back to asking about how Ulster are playing at Ravenhill, or is it Kingsbarns? What is it now?
I think it's the Kingspan. I think is the official title nowadays.
Then I'm getting to these three, and some are apathetic, some are religious, some are antagonistic. Now, apathetic. If they're apathetic, what does that mean? What's underneath that? What must be underneath that is that they just don't think it's true. Because if it is, C.S. Lewis said the one thing it can't be is reasonably. So with them, I might be saying to them, I might be saying to the apathetic person, look. So what I'll sometimes do is I'll get out a packet of cigarettes. And I'll say, if I smoke this packet of cigarettes and I smoke 40 a day, there'd be a point at which you'd say, mate, Rico, that's stupid. You're stupid. It's your own choice, but I'm not your friend unless I say it. So sometimes I get out my cigarette packet. But there's a warning, and there's a warning on the front. Say, don't do this. Smoking ruins your health and it gives lung cancer. I'd say to them, I know you're apathetic about it. You're not worrying, but I'd hold out my cigarette packet and say, I hope you tell me to stop if I was doing that. Well, with you, I've got to say that I think the information about the Christian faith means there's a massive warning on the packet that one day God will say, do you know me? Because I made you for a relationship. Now you may not want to do nothing with it, but can you please acknowledge that I've given you the opportunity now? Because I don't want you on my conscience on that day when God says, do we know each other? So do you see what I mean? So,
yeah.
I'm just going to then do life with them, but I've given them that opportunity. Now, again, it's a pain line. You've got to have your identity in the grace of God, but get your cigarette packet and you just say, by the way, it doesn't have to fish one out the bin. It doesn't have to have, but I quite often use the cigarette packet because my dad made cigarettes as his career, but I just say, look, if you were smoking 40 a day, a good friend would warn you. I need to warn you that I do think it's true. And I want to plead with you to look at it. We've been through COVID. We know death is real. Now, if you're then saying, Rico, forget it, it means you don't think it's true. But at least you say, well, Rico warned me.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I just want to address one more category and then we'll move on. But I think for me, the
we haven't done the three, have we? We've done apathetic. We haven't done religious or antagonistic.
Yeah, I think religious is an interesting one to me because I found even amongst my friends who wouldn't say that they believe in God, in some sense, they almost feel more moral than me as a Christian. They almost feel that their standard of morality is somewhat higher, and actually, they're more tolerant, they're more kind of open-minded, and so on. So almost when I think of religious people now, I almost put them into that category to some extent. What do you make of that?
What I might say to them is, and again, it's a bit of a pain line. You're celebrating and serving. There's a point. You just say to them, what do you think the heart of the Christian faith is? Now, if they are moral and self-righteous, they will go, well, you've got to live a life. You've got to live it and be religious, I think. And I'm then saying to them, and this is week 3 of Christianity Explored, we say this, do you know the heart of the Christian faith actually is not, are you good enough, but are you bad enough? So Christianity is for bad people who need forgiveness. And the reason I'm Christian is I'm a bad man. So I say to them, do you know that's why I became a Christian? I became a Christian because I'm bad, not because I'm good, and I need forgiveness. Now, can I ask you, is that your understanding? So I want to get grace in place for the religious who are living, by their own righteousness and thinking God will accept them. Just to say, I come from a family where those who aren't Christian basically think that God will accept them because they're good. So I've spent my life saying, no, the reason I'm Christian is because I'm bad. So I'll try and get to say, do you see what Christian is? And when they go, look, Christians are pathetic, they don't live that way. And I say, well, no, you're right. I really apologize, but don't let that stop you looking at Jesus, and don't let that stop you look at Good Friday, because what happened there is what it's all about. But I'm so sorry that so-called Christians have behaved badly. And at that point, I might also just say, look, those people who unrepentantly behave badly, they profess being Christians. They're not Christians. They just say they are. Don't think the Crusaders were Christian. They were land grabbing younger sons from Normandy. Do you understand? It's not about are you good enough, but are you bad enough? And on the antagonistic, I'd honestly say to them, look, mate, with this Christian faith, is it that you can't believe it because intellectually you're not persuaded, or is it because you won't, because you're just going to live your own life and be your own boss? So I'm just trying to start a conversation with them. I mean, if they're just antagonistic, or you might say, look, what could I say that would persuade you? I mean, do you want it written in the? Do you want it written by some stars, or I don't know what more God could have done than send His Son to die and rise again. So
those are really helpful kind of examples and the kind of pointers for us, Rico. Thank you for sharing those.
Once you get talking, there are 3 keys to jot down for people. So as you chat, because you want to ask questions and hear them, explore, listen. What are they saying? Secondly, explain what's the next thing about Jesus. So we preach Christ. That's where the power is. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 5. God opens blind eyes. But what can I say? Explain. What can I say that will help them move forward? But thirdly, encourage from your own life. How does this make sense? So from my life, my godfather gets killed in 1982, and I wake up to the fact I'm going to die. That's what made me think about Jesus, because he got through death. So those 3 things: explore, explain, encourage. That's the internal DNA of trying to just dialogue and chat with people.
I think if we're honest, Rico, certainly if I'm honest, I think we often make excuses in our heads as to why we don't share the gospel, and we maybe put it off, or we say, I'll do it at another time when circumstances are more favorable, or whatever. And in your book, Honest Evangelism, you mentioned 3 truths that have motivated you personally when it comes to evangelism. And I was wondering if you could just briefly share those truths with us.
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 G's. The first is grace. So Victor Hugo said, life's greatest happiness is to be convinced you're loved. And if I see my sin as it really is, and then am staggered that God has given me the gift, not just of Christ's forgiveness, but also of his perfect righteous life. So Luther, in as he read Romans 1:17 in 1510, had this tower experience when he realized the essence of Christianity was not a righteousness we give to God, but we receive it from God. So as God sees me, he sees me as perfect. I mean, it's just extraordinary that God should view me as perfect, because I'm so depraved, but that's the gift that I get given. Now, if I understand that, I then live not for approval, but from it. And this declaration of righteousness is given to me. And if I understand that, then and I really see my sin clearly, then it becomes overwhelming, this grace. And I long for it to be something other people will understand. Do they get grace? Because if you do get it, life becomes a joy. You can forgive anyone anything, as Lloyd Jones said. So one, am I living by grace? Secondly, Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was the second G. That was the stinking public rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where fires were kept constantly burning. The bodies of criminals were thrown there, animal carcasses. And when Jesus wanted to explain what it would be like for those who died with their sin unforgiven, he said they go to the fire, to Gehenna. So does hell exist? Jesus says it does, again and again. Matthew 5 verse 30, Matthew verse 21, Matthew 5 verse 28 and 29, Matthew 7 verses 10 to 14, Matthew 8 verse 28. I mean, he just reference after reference about hell. So Jesus is the theologian of hell. And what is it like? It's a place of separation, of punishment. And then who goes there? Those who do what they like with the hands God given them, the feet God's given them, the eyes God's given them. They do what they like. And the reason they're punished is God says, what you do with the hands, eyes, and feet I've given you matters to me, my creator. So that's the second thing. There is a place called hell, and those people who are unforgiven go to pay for their sin themselves there. And so will you warn people? We're in debt. How can we possibly allow them to be going to hell and not warn them? Now, what they then do with the warning's up to them. But I remember I preached on John 1 verse 29, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, when I was at theological college. And I gave a tape of that to a friend, and 4 of them played it one evening in a rugby house. This was at Oxford. And Dave, who was captain of the Blues, said after I'd spoken on this tape, he said, Rico's not my friend. They said, what do you mean he's not your friend? He said, well, half an hour. I thought he was one of my best friends. We played in the front row together. We played golf together. We roomed together on tour. But if that's what he believes, the fact he said nothing to me means he doesn't care for me. It's amazing. So he said, I may not believe it, but if Rico believes that, he said nothing to me in 18 months, it means he doesn't care. So this guy who I'd given the tape to called Ed rang me up and he said, you need to talk to Dave. He's very upset you've not spoken to him. And I then spoke to Dave and he said, yeah, you should have spoken to me if you believe that. So if we believe that the heart of the Christian faith is being saved from hell through the cross for heaven and don't speak to people, that is a terrible thing, Ollie. And often I say to people, we care more about what people think of us now, what God will think of them on Judgment Day. So that's the second one, Gehenna.
That's a real challenge. And it's very similar to what the lady said to you on the door that day as well. It's a similar response.
She's saying, if you believe it, warn me. There's an amazing Penn and Teller, the magician, in the little book, Honest Evangelism. I called it Honest Evangelism because we're not being honest about the fact we can get rejected, and we're not being honest about the gospel, which is there is this judgment to come. But Penn and Teller in that, he says, look, I'm an atheist, but this guy spoke to me about the gospel, and he said, if that's what he believes that a truck's going to hit me, and he doesn't tell me anything, that's appalling. I said, I've got no problem. He's told me because he cares. I don't think it's true, but he does. And how appalling not to tell me if you do think it's true. So we become functional universalists. We don't really believe it, or we'd say it. And then thirdly, the glory of God. Now, the greatest motivation for evangelism in the Bible, Ollie, is God's glory. So we want God to be honored. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. So whether people respond or not, it honors God by saying to people, what do you think of his son? So again, that glory is a great motivation. So those three, we want to be constantly cycling through.
Excellent. Thank you, Rico. I want to get sort of very practical now. I know we have touched on some sort of practical conversation starters, but I want to just dig a little bit more on that. As I mentioned earlier, Freshers Week is upon us, and lots of our listeners will maybe just be starting uni. Some will maybe be starting jobs. And it can probably feel a little bit daunting heading into quite a secular university or workplace. And I would love it if you would help us just think through that experience and how can we sort of encourage people not to withdraw and kind of form a little Christian holy huddle somewhere and maybe even start conversation. So like really practically, what does it look like to engage with new people we're meeting on campus and get to know them, but then ultimately have that what feels like a gear change at some point and actually start a gospel conversation, invite someone to an event? What does that look like in practice?
Well, Ollie, I think the first thing to do when you get to uni is the first 24 hours are the most important. And you've just got to identify yourself as a Christian. I remember my best mate at uni was a guy called Harry, who very sadly, again, he died of a pulmonary embolism when he was 38. But I got to uni and we'd done pre-season training, and a couple of days in, he said, Rico, I hear you're a bit of a Bible basher. I said, no, I am. Now, I'd put my Bible by my bed. Someone had obviously said that to him, but I was delighted that he knew that was who I was. So you don't find yourself going on a night out and getting just into a situation where you're totally trolleyed. You're just saying, look, guys, I mean, I'm afraid I'm a bit of a Bible basher, everyone, but you do enjoy people. So, be self-mocking about it, but say, I'm afraid, all good Christians going to heaven get to bed before 11. So I've always had a smile on my I know my identity, but say, I've got to get up for church. But let them know early that that's where you are. Now, some of them may well then decide not to relate to you, but certainly in Ulster, they'll have done Boys Brigade. They'll have an auntie who's a deeply committed Christian. I mean, Ulster is so wonderfully permeated with gospel people. And they may have had a bad experience in which you say, look, that's terrible. I'm so sorry that was bad. But, for me, the heart of it is Jesus, and I don't reject him. The poet Swinburne said, I would love Jesus. I would love Christ if it were not for his leprous bride, the church. Well, my love for Christ causes me to save the church, but what I'm going on about is Jesus. So that's the first thing. Let them know you're Christian. Secondly, pray for love for them. Now, there was a great survey done just before lockdown called Talking Jesus. And in it, we found that 67% 90% of people in Britain had a Christian friend they liked. And why did they like them? They liked them because they were selfless, they were kind. So be kind, be interested, ask questions. So get good at, one of the things I say in my book is get good at asking questions. So it's not just, what do you think of the Christian faith? It's tell us about your parents. Where are you from? Ever been to Ravenhill, Kingsbarn, or whatever it is? Where'd you go on holiday? Did you go up to the North Coast? Well, what do you do on that? So just be good at asking. What's your subject? Why did you enjoy it? Who was your favorite teacher at school? Who are your brothers and sisters? Where do your grandparents live? Just be interested. Other people aren't good at asking questions, so ask questions. Celebrate people, but secondly, serve them. If you're arriving as a fresher, I mean, I found I didn't know where to sign up, and I was asking people. Sometimes you haven't read the thing. Oh, I think we're doing this, then we're doing that, and can I buy you a sandwich? So just be kind. People love kindness. But then thirdly, it's look, I better tell you, just so that you won't know, but I'll be going to church on Sunday. Just that's what I do. I mean, it's great, but just get that in there that you do that. Or do you know if there are any good churches around here, or have you heard about that church, or do you ever go, or just something that just puts it on the mat there? And then if they go quiet, they'll be nervous too. You exit it, or they might talk about that a bit. So I would just, maybe a question like, do you ever think about spiritual things? But again, it's going to be a pain line. Celebrate, serve, but there's going to be a nervousness, but ask it, cross it. A lot of people don't do evangelism, but they say, well, it doesn't feel particularly good. It doesn't feel good for any of us. Some of us do it anyway, but we've just got to cross the line and do that.
Absolutely. And I think, being clear right from the start that you're a Christian, I've personally found that very helpful at university.
I think, Ollie, people value integrity.
Yeah.
Don't, just come out who you are. I mean, just tell, this is who I am. But by the way, I'm interested in you. I'm not a judgmental person. I'd love to know more about you. But yeah, this is who I am. By the way, my biggest problem is my sin. It's not yours. So if you think I'm an authentic Christians are thinking about their own need of forgiveness. They're not pointing the finger. I can tell you, I'm not. But and so I'd be saying that. Yeah.
Those are really helpful pointers, and we'll definitely be praying for those students as they head off to uni at the start of this new year. Rico, in your book, you also write this, that the content of Christian witness never changes, but the context of our witness does. Back in the 1950s, Billy Graham was preaching to crowds of thousands of people, and many seemed to be coming to faith. And I recall stories of my grandfather preaching in Belfast in the 40s and 50s, and it seemed like multiple people were coming to faith back then, even through his preaching. And to be honest, sometimes I get a little bit demoralized when we don't seem to see those large-scale kind of comings to Christ happening in the UK anymore quite in that way. And my question really is, are those big gospel campaigns a thing of the past? And why are things different in 2022?
Well, the first thing to say is there are always three great principles of evangelism, and that's whether it's a big campaign or one-to-one. And the three principles are, one, sovereignty. So 2 Corinthians 4, verse 6, we've looked at it before. We need God to open blind eyes. Verse 4, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers. So we need the sovereign Lord and he is the one that brings people to himself. So this girl I spoke to on Sunday, who, as she was watching a YouTube clip, suddenly cried out Jesus because she saw the evil. That was the Lord regenerating her heart. So the sovereign Lord opens eyes. We need to pray. Secondly, we got to tell the truth. So whether it's Billy Graham or your grandfather, whoever it is, it's not the preacher, it's the message. And we preach Jesus as Lord. Be faithful. But thirdly, creativity. Verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 4, ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. 1 Corinthians 9 picks that up and says, what does it mean to be a servant? Be all things to all people to win as many as possible. So my third key area is, well, what's most appropriate for people? So for example, during COVID, we had to go online to preach the gospel. We couldn't see people. Go out for a walk and try to see people. But that means you've got to keep changing. So it's the same message, Jesus is Lord, but it's a different environment. Now, people would come to football stadiums in the 1950s and hear it, But what was interesting then, Ollie, is the great line once they'd been forward and professed faith was, your coaches will wait. In other words, they were already in Christian community. They were already in church. They just got converted out of church. So 40,000 people got converted at Haringey in the 1955 mission. But of those, 90% were churchgoers. So they were, the culture was quite Christian, but Billy said, repent and believe. So what that means is now people are a long way from coming to church, and they need that individual discipling. They don't even trust me, the vicar. They don't really trust me, but they do trust their friend. So get the Bible open. I often talk about the word one-to-one, which goes through John's gospel, where you get the question and the answer, and they're just, the passage is done. You just read through it and read through a little question and answer that goes with it. But you're always preaching Christ, you're always praying, and then you just got to keep being flexible. Now, whether God gives lots of people to come to faith or none, that's up to him. This girl, Anne-Marie, on Sunday, it was just marvelous. I mean, she got converted watching YouTube on the sofa, and that was March. She has been profoundly converted.
That's wonderful.
So, but it's up to the Lord to do that. What I've got to do is just keep trying to preach Christ.
Fantastic. No, that's really useful and encouraging, actually, Rico. And when it comes to one-to-one Bible studies, I think a lot of the students might be familiar with Uncover as well, which is another fantastic resource for saying to a friend. I actually had a friend at uni who he thought the idea of coming to church with me was hilarious. Like, he was like, "Oh, I'd never go to church," but he was prepared to sit in a coffee shop and look through Luke's gospel with me. I was very open to that. It's a fantastic way to point people to Jesus.
And on that one, you say, have you looked yourself? And then you say, please don't allow secondhand opinion on this. I mean, if this is true, it's the most important thing in the world. It's eternal. So I don't mind you rejecting it, but just make sure it's your opinion, not anyone else's, that caused you to reject it.
Absolutely. Just as we begin to close now, Rico, I asked a number of our listeners to submit some questions for you to address in this episode, and I'm going to put a few of those to you now. So Timmy Emerson asks, where's the most hostile place or environment you've shared the gospel, and why do you think that was?
Well, I have been no platformed in this country, which means that they wouldn't allow me to speak. So I suppose that's publicly, and that was in Parliament, actually. I was doing the Easter service in Parliament, and because I'd made just orthodox statements saying that the place for sex was between a man and a woman within marriage, and anywhere outside of that was, according to the Bible, going to mean that you face God's judgment. So that was upsetting, and in fact, I was glad my mother was dead when that was said, because it would have really upset her that I'd been no platform from Parliament. But that's meant to be the home of free speech, so that was a bit sad, and I thought pathetic that they were too afraid to just have an Orthodox clergyman come and speak at an Easter service, when, of course, I was never going to speak about human sexuality. I just was going to speak about Jesus being Lord and risen from the dead and give them hope in the face of death.
That is incredibly sad.
The other place that was tough, and I think was at school. I'd just become a Christian at school, and Billy Graham came in 1984, and there were magazines written against the Christians. There were about 10 of us, and we did invite a lot to Billy Graham, but there were magazines that came out. And I think what was hard then with those magazines was my identity wasn't secure in Christ. It's much easier now when I get attacked, but so get your identity secure in the grace of God. That's where you know you're loved, not whether someone rejects or accepts you. And I think what made school hard was when the persecution happened, I was still wanting my friends to like me. I think they liked me much more when I decided I didn't care what they thought, but I was going to try and love them because Jesus loved them. I think that was, but if you don't get clear on the identity, it doesn't matter what environment you're in, you're going to shut up, because there are going to be times when we get rejected, and it's not our fault. We've been as gracious as possible. People just don't want the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Pete Wright asks about evangelism to those who are in Gen Z. And that's those born between 1997 and 2012. And he says, do you think we need to be taking a different approach with Gen Z than millennials or baby boomers? Do you think
there should be a different?
Brilliant question. Always we've got to say, right, sovereignty, am I saying my prayers? I need God to do the miracle. Integrity, am I telling the truth? But thirdly, creativity, yes. So we've got to say, yeah, how do we reach this group? So it might be that for example, at the moment, the treatment of women. I mean, Sarah Everard, I'm in London at the moment, was killed by a policeman. And I want to maybe begin on evangelism saying, by the way, it's a great thing there's a judgment to come, because had Sarah Everard's killer, and 15 women have been killed in London, murdered in London since then, I can say, I think it's a wonderful thing there's a judgment to come, because it means how I treat you, how you treat me, how you treat Sarah Everard matters to God, and there's a judgment. So actually, so look at the generation, look what matters to them. You've got to preach the whole gospel, but you might start with something different. I think a lot of that generation won't come to church. What'll they come to? Oh, well, they might come to a pub. So perhaps in the pub I could run a little Christianity Explored. If they're teetotal, then fine, be sensitive to that, but don't ask them to come to a venue that they might feel, I don't particularly want to go to the Hindu temple or the mosque. They might not want to come to the church. It's totally alien, but what will they come to?
Absolutely. No, really useful. We also had a couple of questions around sharing the gospel with the LGBT community, and I think we've touched on that to some extent, but a couple of people asked, how can we do that well? What does it look like to speak the truth in love to those in that community? Someone asked, does that mean that we should be using preferred pronouns, and so on? Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, and I'm sure this is true in Ulster as well, is that community have in the past been treated terribly. So I went to the same school as Alan Turing, who helped invent the Enigma machine and helped shorten the war by 2 years. And they think around 40 million lives were saved by that decoding machine. And yet Alan Turing was pursued to his death by 1957 by government who were trying to chemically castrate him, and he took his own life. It was horrific, and he was a national hero. So what I first want to say is, I'll die for your right to be able to live your life as you want to live. But I would say to them this, I would say, there is a community at my church who are same-sex attracted, but they're celibate. I'd love you to meet an individual from there, because I think that their story would be interesting for you. So please don't think that I'm homophobic. I'm not. I mean, on Saturday evening here, I've got 2 friends coming who are precious friends coming to my house, who are both same-sex attracted celibate people. So the narrative on this is, have you heard of that group? So livingout.org is the website. Can they look at that? So if they say, well, of course you're anti me because you're Christian and I'm LGBT, you say, well, no, I've got huge LGBT friends at church who actually, let me introduce you to them.
Rico, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a really helpful conversation. And just as we wrap up, I understand you're coming to Northern Ireland very soon to speak at a conference on evangelism. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and I'd love to hear why our listeners should attend.
Yes, Mere Evangelism, on Saturday, the 1st of October, we're coming, and it's about C.S. Lewis. Of course, Lewis has huge Ulster connections, and it's the lessons from Lewis that we can learn. And that's going to be in Bangor. And just to say that we've just been thrilled with what Lewis teaches us on evangelism. And there's a book on it that's been written by Randy Newman on the subject. So it's the 1st of October in Hamilton Road Presbyterian Church, 10 o'clock. Please join us for Mere Evangelism, insights from C.S. Lewis on Outreach Day. People love C.S. Lewis, Ollie. They love Lewis. They love Narnia. They know he's a genius, the non-Christian does. And therefore, it's great to, if you've got Lewis up your sleeve, that it's a real way in with people.
Fantastic. So that's the Mere Evangelism Conference 2022, and it's happening on the 1st of October at 10 a.m. at Hamilton Road Presbyterian Church. And you can buy tickets now via evangelism-conference.org.uk. So we'd really encourage you to sign up for that and go along. Thanks so much, Rico, again, and may the Lord continue to bless you in your service for him in central London. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Ollie, thanks so much. And first 24 hours at university, Get your Bible out, put it by your bed, make sure they know you're Christian.